Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about data and privacy. In debates about privacy, particularly that of the digital realm, there is one argument made with unnerving prevalence against the individual's right to maintain it. On a policy level, it's often touted alongside concerns of national security, where the state simply must infringe upon the right of privacy to protect the citizenry. In casual conversation, however, there's a frightening level of apathy and acceptance of the status quo that has cemented it in the public's consciousness. It is this: if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. What this essay intends to do is try and dispel that statement. To the contrary, this could accurately be seen as an argument for privacy, precisely because there is much to fear, and to be extremely critical of and resistant to. Both state and corporate entities have built and shaped institutions and rules that can peer into all aspects of our lives. The effects of this, and the capabilities in the hands of these bastions of power, have far overstepped what a genuinely free and democratic society should accept. A brief definition of privacy will be provided, followed by a discussion of the role of capital in data collection and the effect it's had on privacy and thought. The mass data collection by the state will also be explored, including the scope of powers of law enforcement and intelligence agencies and the real-world implications and applications of this digital panopticon. Finally, the above maxim will be reflected back onto the state, revealing the secrecy and hypocrisy of an institution that demands the transparency of its citizens. Privacy is a difficult concept to define, and an even more difficult one to try and implement. Molitorus refers to it as a shapeshifter, noting various theories and lenses to approaching it. Moore defines it as an individual's right to control access to and uses of places, bodies, and personal information, calling it a necessary condition for human well-being or flourishing. For the purposes of this essay, this control definition, particularly in relation to social media and the mass collection of data online, is the most prudent, given our ability to control our data over networked systems has been drastically eroded by state and capital. While the political implications and effects of state surveillance are immense, it is prudent to start with a discussion of capital for two reasons. Firstly, while state intelligence agencies are like giant sponges, absorbing all the data they can, they are large, singular, and known entities, if hidden behind secrecy. Data as a commodity is collected by and sold to a myriad of companies, some of them who are well-known monopolies like Google, Amazon, or Facebook, but also many others across the technology and advertising worlds. Does anyone know how many companies have been provided or sold access to your private data and what their names are? Second, monopolies and surveillance capitalism are themselves threats to privacy by design, and the practices of these companies are not always benevolent or ethical. More and more products within the umbrella of smart homes and the Internet of Things are providing greater services to users, the trade-off being the invasive nature of these devices in homes. The amount of power and influence gained through the commodification and exploitation of personal data is an unfolding phenomenon, but it has already had alarming effects. For instance, Facebook has been at the center of a number of controversial studies and campaigns involving the psychological manipulation of its users. In 2014, a study came out detailing how users' behaviors and emotions changed as a result of how many positive or negative posts they were exposed to over a set period of time. And the answer is quite a bit in both directions. This proved that not only did these social media monopolies have the capacity to manipulate news feeds, which was hardly a secret, but that the potential to use this to shape behaviors was also very real. This came into dystopian fruition in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where the data of millions of Facebook users was used to undertake behavioral micro-targeting in political advertising. This is not a new tool in political circles. Obama was famously one of the first prominent political figures to adopt social media as a means of mass communication, including advertising. But in recent years, the sheer scale and detail has only increased, with dire consequences for democracy. Whether for commercial or political purposes, anyone who uses these social feeds, or indeed the internet at all, ought to be highly skeptical and concerned about the amount of personal data being collected and how it's being used. Kant, writing in 1875, said of rational beings that they are to treat themselves and all others never merely as a means, but always at the same time as ends in themselves. Data in the modern era, digital and discrete packets of information, virtual abstractions of ourselves, is used as a means mostly for monetization, but also to influence our behaviors and thoughts. From purchasing habits to voting, dating apps to medical decisions, this data is used to feed algorithms that frequently provide specific information, or information in specific ways, to guide our actions subtly or explicitly for a particular purpose. How free our free choice and markets are in the face of advertising giants is worth greater scrutiny. The argument of having nothing to hide, from a corporate perspective, begins from the premise that data is a commodity they require and have access to, and that human behavior and interactions are processes to shape and exploit. Some jurisdictions, such as the European Union, are making moves to curb this degradation of privacy in favor of profits. The response from some in the business world is to warn against hasty storms of regulation and to instead adopt a model of monetization, whereby consumers are offered a value compensation method to reasonably pay for privacy losses or knowledge contributions. While this method is context dependent, this is simply incentivizing people to allow the exploitation of their personal data. It also, coincidentally, turns privacy itself into a commodity, raising ethical questions about who exactly gets to afford privacy online. As revealing and concerning as the corporate use of data is, states have at their disposal not only immense technological powers and reach with regards to surveillance, but also the force and ostensible legitimacy to justify, enforce, and act upon it. From zero-day exploits to backdoor access into systems, intelligence sharing between states to domestic law enforcement's use of algorithms and AI, states have a vested interest in maintaining hegemony in the sphere of cyberspace and protecting digital power into the real world. State interests, however, are not necessarily aligned with the interests of citizens, both within and outside their respective borders. As mentioned earlier, the argument of nothing to hide, in practice, is closely related to national security and the legislation that follows, particularly in the wake of 9/11. The premise here, however, is dangerous. It essentially assumes that anyone could be a potential threat, and therefore the collection of everyone's data is an inevitable and necessary precaution to prevent terror. Putting aside the fact that this rationale has basically been disproven, there are a number of serious implications for individual privacy and liberty, and as an extension of that, society. For certain groups in the West, such as Muslims or black people, the white nation-state can be deeply discriminatory and even deadly. Arabs and Muslims, for example, have been imagined as suspect communities and have faced increased discrimination and surveillance, their ethnicity and or religion being grounds enough to cause alarm. For black people, particularly in the US, the collection and use of facial recognition data by law enforcement is a major issue, as many of the algorithms and databases are not only more likely to profile them, but the reliability and accuracy when tested on non-white faces is staggeringly and disturbingly low. These algorithms, ostensibly neutral and objective, are just digital reflections of societal biases and prejudices. While John Stuart Mill in On Liberty believed it was one of the undisputed functions of government to take precautions against crime before it has been committed, he also admits that the preventative function of government, however, is far more liable to be abused to the prejudice of liberty than to the punitory function. The increase in profiling and interventions by law enforcement against black people as a result of faulty and simply racist surveillance and data collection methods is almost certainly an abuse of liberty by the state. One need only look at the rate of incarceration and police murders of black people in the United States to understand how. More broadly, this level of data collection has detrimental effects on freedom of speech and expression, including on those in the media or activists who are ostensibly in a position of holding truth to power. Surveillance by the government is by no means a new phenomenon, well before the advent of Snowden and the digital era. In 1949, the Australian Secret Intelligence Office, ASIO, essentially a national security agency with a penchant for domestic spying, was created by the chiefly Labour government and took a keen interest in a wide range of activists and, being a product of the forthcoming Cold War, a number of socialists and other radicals too. A number of people, encouraged by Meredith Bergman, applied to see their own files with mixed results, but many who did receive their files revealed how extensive the surveillance of themselves and their friends, families and associates was. Since 9/11, the reach of government surveillance has had very clear ramifications for freedom of speech and expression online, with a number of writers and journalists keenly aware that their communications and work are being monitored in some form. As such, this chilling effect places limits on an individual's perception of free speech and thought, and this extends outwards, limiting the scope of speech and thought in the wider population. As Molitorus put it, the privacy of the individual is not just for their personal benefit, but for the benefit of everyone else as well. That is not to say that dissent in radical groups and activism have been quashed by the state, far from it. But the political freedom to dissent ought to be strongly protected and is not legitimate grounds for the invasions of privacy carried out by ASIO or other comparable intelligence agencies. In fact, the nothing to hide mantra can very easily be turned on governments and yet is strongly opposed by the state, which unlike individuals has the institutional power to prevent it. ASIO itself does not always provide files and has often lied about the existence in certain instances. The treatment of journalists and whistleblowers in cases where national security is repeated as for justification is quite telling as well. Perhaps the most high-profile cases of the digital age are Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden, the latter in exile and the others having faced what amounts to torture and human rights abuses. Here in Australia, journalists such as John Martinkus were harassed by the Howard government for their reporting on the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and in 2019 the ABC was raided by the Australian Federal Police for publishing stories based on leaked defence documents relating to conduct in Afghanistan. While now dropped, the former coalition government had been in the process of prosecuting witness K and his lawyer Bernard Collaery over the revelations of ASIS's involvement in espionage against Timor-Leste amidst maritime border and resource negotiation. Deeper probing into the secrecy of the state is beyond the scope of this essay. Those few examples make it quite clear that while citizens must be subjected to mass surveillance and in some cases extensive intrusions on their lives, the state itself is exempt from that and can in fact wield harsh penalties for those who dare shine a light on them. Most people, including political dissidents, are likely not hiding anything, and it is a gross violation of their liberties and right to privacy to sweep everyone up in the vain hopes of finding some instances of wrongdoing. I believe Molitorus is misguided when he says, "A vast difference exists between a hacker gaining unauthorized access to a webcam for personal gain and an AI system employed by the government for national security that automatically records webcam footage no human will ever see unless a court orders otherwise." When states, even ostensibly democratic ones, do clearly hide many things and have long revealing records of their use of surveillance, deferring to increased legislation and regulation is not enough. Improvement could potentially be made in such cases like the European Union, but institutions of state and capital cannot reliably be trusted to regulate themselves, and in many cases they have accelerated the mass production and collection of data. Molitorus bases his entire privacy framework on the relational nature of data, which is an excellent approach, but his conclusion fits comfortably within a system that allows those violations of privacy to occur in the first place. People ought to know when and if the government is spying on them, because it affects a lot more than just the monitored individual. Stronger and more democratic systems of control over data have been proposed globally by grassroots and community movements, with a focus on personal ownership of data and a privacy by design approach to computer hardware and software. The control the institutions of state and capital have over our data, and by extension our lives, dispels the myth that the ordinary person has nothing to fear. Our very beings can and have been manipulated for political and commercial purposes, and the spectre of surveillance can silence dissent and ingrain apathy. However, instead of fear and apathy, this should instead allow us the opportunity to explore alternatives to the status quo that prioritize privacy and freedoms. The inherent hypocrisy of states and corporations maintaining high levels of secrecy shows that the existing system simply cannot be trusted to provide either, and this is by design. What these new and vastly different systems will look like, we can hardly say at this stage, but it will undoubtedly be centered around the digital sphere. Which future we end up with entirely depends on how much control the populace has and upon which ideals and demands they bring to the table. Thank you for watching this video. All the references used in this essay should currently be scrolling up the screen, and if you have any thoughts on privacy or its relation to state and capital, please let me know in the comments below. Have a great day, everyone.